Also, I'm glad to be here, I must say. It's great to meet comrades that I've known for years and haven't seen also for years, and find out what has been developing in that time. Also, very interesting to hear about projects that I've only known at a distance. And I really found that the roundtable before our two talks was extremely valuable to me, and for that I thank you all for this chance to be here and address you. As Simon said, I moved back to the States in 2009 from France, where I lived for 20 years. And in that time, one of the things that I've done has been to work on an attempt to actualize the really large body of theory coming mainly out of Marxism, which is known as crisis theory. And the point of that is to try to see how society changes and to try to see that effectively in the present and with an eye to the future, in my case. I think the two maybe are quite connected because we are developing and moving into the unknown all the time. The crisis theory I'm thinking of, it begins with a Soviet figure, a Russian, Kondratiev, also Trotsky, and then later the Belgian theorist Ernst Mandel. But it also has another genealogy on the capitalist and ultimately neoliberal side, which comes from the economist Joseph Schumpeter, whom you may have heard of, and also a number of sort of centrist or post-Marxist theorists who deal with the transformations of technology. And I'll be talking a fair bit about those transformations of technology. Just to catch you up a little or remind you about the kind of basic ideas of crisis theory, what's said in the simplest version, the very simplest version, is that capitalism grows on the basis of some set of technologies, like, for instance, steam power and the railroads, or maybe fiber optic cables and computers, and that it creates a whole series of organizational forms and ways of, exploiting those technologies. It reaches a peak, and then problems appear. The markets are saturated. You can't sell that stuff anymore. And the whole system declines, sometimes very precipitously, into some kind of depression. And in the simplest version of that theory, during that depression, capitalists do not invest in technology. There is an investment strike. They put their money, nowadays they put it in the financial markets, and inventions pile up. And then in those happy days when everything comes together, there are plenty of new inventions around, and you get a new wave. Okay, let's make that theory more complicated. The more complicated, the second version of the theory says there are many more factors at work. That one of the key factors is social struggle, so that capitalism encounters its own contradictions in the relationship with those who work and with those who do not work also. And that the forms of government that allow the system to be stable, or to be, in capitalist terms, stable, that is to say growing, break down. Not only do they break down on the national level or on the level of the inside of an economy, but they also break down on the geopolitical level, between different economic spheres, also between producer countries and the countries that supply raw materials. And so you get a kind of much more general sort of contradiction, problem, impasse, and that this is only solved when a couple of things happen. One, fundamental changes in the way that we are governed and the way that businesses handle their relationships with those who work, the way that governments handle their relationships also with those who don't work. And then secondly, when conditions in the world allow for new markets to develop. And I think we've all lived through a version of this last thing because, you know, everyone experienced 1989, the key date to which the whole concept of the former West refers. And then we all witnessed and lived through the moment when the barrier of the Cold War division having been removed, we saw capitalism, using a new set of technologies, basically expand the sphere of capitalist social relations all across the earth, doubling the labor force in the process and really creating this world of globalization. So that's already a more complex version, which of course I use in my study. Now the third thing, and the really interesting thing, I think, is what do social movements and what do vanguard movements contribute to these processes? And it seems to me that one can also trace, to some degree, the curves of these movements. Because, you know, I mean, we're all very affected by the most radical movements of 1968 and of the 70s, still. So that has had a tremendous effect on society. But such movements, at least three things happen to them. One, they are defeated. This, of course, can be said to have happened to the movements that began in 68. Two, they are absorbed into society. And I will have quite a bit to say about that. What happens when, you know, contestatory movements are absorbed into society. Third, they continue, they survive, and they go through metamorphoses, so that you find what appear to be traces of an old movement looking very, very different. So we have different forms of communism and anarchism throughout these cycles that are shown here. And what I'm concerned with is what's going to happen to that sort of transformative continuity of the left now and in the near future. Because I really think that now we are at the depth of the current crisis. And society in all of these crises has changed radically. I think it will change radically again. I think it's already in the process of changing radically. It doesn't just change into one thing. It changes into a new combination of things. What I find important is not so much that there be a complete victory or a complete loss for what used to be called the left, but that the new combination bear the imprint of a more egalitarian and caring form of life, caring for ourselves and for our relation with nature, which is one of the primary things that we have to care about in this world if we want to care for each other. So this is kind of what follows is a written paper, and in this paper I'm really attempting to come to some conclusions about 4 or 5 years of work on this subject, which in a way coincides with the concluding phase of the project of the former West, because I think that the former West, you know, was defined because of 1989. I think that this hangover of the former West continued throughout the entire neoliberal period. I believe that the former West is now coming to an end, and I think there will be some quite different experiences ahead of us in the future. So, live your models. Throughout the 20th century and up to today, art has been a prodigious creator of models. Models of the self, models of history, models of society and technology and communication, models of the interactions between all these. Now is the time to live your models. Once every 40 to 50 years, the core capitalist economies are gripped by a structural crisis with repercussions in the entire world. Think about the 1970s, or in a more dramatic way, the 1930s. Look further back, and you find another long recessionary period culminating in the early 1890s, then still another leading up to the turmoil of 1848. Clearly, the historical periods in question are all wildly different. But what's similar about these crises is that they last a decade or more. They're not quick. They are not just economic, and they end with profound shifts in the social order. Today, globalized capitalism is in the middle of such a crisis, which began in 2008. If it simply runs its course, this process of change is likely to usher in a new techno-economic paradigm and a new ethos, or what Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapello once called a new spirit of capitalism. I think that everyone, regardless of their geographic location or political orientation, should take pause before contributing to such a new spirit. The artistic question is, how do you model the process of change? The existential question is, what do you want from it? 15 years ago, I was among those who made a critical analysis of the ways that the rebels of the last structural crisis, the generations of 1968 and their inheritors, had subsequently adapted, both socially and psychology, to the political economy of neoliberalism. I did this as a part of a larger intellectual and aesthetic program, the cognitive mapping of financial globalization, carried out with the conceptual art group Bureau d'études, to develop a critical model of the postmodern self. I coined a deliberately ambiguous term, the flexible personality. As I wrote at that time, 15 years ago, the word flexible alludes directly to the current economic system with its casual labor contracts, its just-in-time production, its informational products, and its absolute dependence on virtual currency circulating in the financial sphere. But it also refers to an entire set of very positive images: spontaneity, creativity, cooperativity, mobility, peer relations, appreciation of difference, and openness to present experience. Like Boltanski and Chiapello, I describe these positive images from the 60s and 70s as a kind of disorienting force, acting to cover up and mask the coercive elements of the neoliberal order. Unlike Boltanski and Chiapello, I insisted that there was no going back from the turning point of 1968. The welfare state had reached its limits, and society had to change. That's where the ambiguities lie. On my view, the radical experiments of the 60s and 70s were not misguided, and that's what Boltanski and Chiapello tend to say. They say they were wrong, they contributed to neoliberalism, they destroyed the welfare state. I don't see it that way. I don't think the radical experiments of the 60s and 70s were misguided. Yet, many of them were clearly absorbed into the new hegemony of neoliberalism. Today, I think that society has to change again. This time, the absorption of radical experiments will be our direct responsibility. A structural crisis means that everything changes. Right now, as neoliberal principles are pushed to their logical conclusions, what's happening is that everything liberal about the former social order is disappearing. Welfare state liberalities in the areas of housing, education, culture, unemployment insurance, and retirement have obviously been under continuous attack for the last 30 years, and today, in a great majority of countries, it seems that only socialized healthcare will survive, if anything. Civil liberties, which had been the great justification of the former West during the Cold War, and which were so fervently exalted after the fall of the former East, are everywhere being curtailed as the long-predicted society of control becomes a reality. Finally, the liberal free trade regime itself, which has been the cornerstone of American policy since 1945, is now seriously threatened by the massive deficits of many countries, by the massive trade surpluses of China and Germany, and by the rush of all players to pursue export-oriented strategies at the expense of their neighbors. So it looks like even that, the liberal free trade regime, could be transformed in this crisis. For the majority of the population, a crisis is measured by the lack of social welfare and of civil liberties. For capital, a crisis is measured by the inability to manage a liberal free trade regime. And so we have two kinds of crises going on. I'm going to talk first about the people's viewpoint and then about capital's viewpoint. From a people's viewpoint, the benefits of liberal societies are waning in the face of three fundamental challenges to the 20th century form of popular democracy. The first is that economic growth no longer produces employment. The double punch of automation and global supply chains has decimated the industrial working classes without in any way abolishing work. And computer algorithms, combined with speech recognition technologies, are doing the same thing for a wide range of middle-class professions. What's left is a lot of meaningless toil, police repression of the poor, and super profits for the financiers. The second fundamental challenge is the profusion of armed conflict and the waves of refugees that flow from it. The breakdown of the US-led security system after the failed wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, and I would also add Libya, where France has a greater responsibility, combined with the desperation of Russia since 2008, have brought battle and its consequences right up to the gateways of the European Union. In a similar way, the collapse of Mexico, Honduras, and other Latin American countries is overwhelming US borders, while the partial takeover of the Mexican state by narco cartels constitutes a paramilitary threat comparable to that of the Islamic State. And no one yet knows whether the current assertion of Chinese naval power in international waters will ultimately lead to war in Asia. But the third fundamental challenge is the worst: climate change. The growing intensity of storms, droughts, floods, and fires opens up a new chapter in human history. Those of us involved with art and philosophy have had to face the realization that technological modernity and the economic emancipation of billions of human beings have been bound up with a basic mistake, which is the structural reliance of industrial civilization on fossil fuels and poisonous chemicals. So-called postmodernism never dealt with the problem, but lingered instead in its cultural disorientation, as though the multiplication of subjectivities itself constituted a solution. So this is the thing I'm trying to get at, is that all of this is very disorienting, and perhaps the most disorienting thing is climate change itself, because it calls into question the whole basis of industrial civilization. So how to imagine a way forward? How to embark on a long journey when the path remains invisible? From capital's viewpoint, no grand strategy to address the triple crisis has yet emerged. But one ultimately will, and then they will invest in real things. Previous experience suggests that vanguard social movements, forged perhaps during the moment of prosperity, strengthened and made tougher during the Depression, can make an impact on the next upswing of the capitalist system. That's what I tried to trace with the flexible personality, how those movements actually made an impact, for better and for worse, on the new form of capitalism, which we now know as neoliberalism. Now today, to be significant today, I think such movements have to be populist, but also radically new. They have to respond to present and future conditions, drawing on whatever is ready to hand, but avoiding the inertial force of past compromises and sterile co-optations. Over the course of the next decade, such movements will have to solve the practical problems of complex societies and not simply provide an aesthetic mask over a fresh economic expansion, which is unlikely to benefit large numbers of people if it ever comes at all. It's obvious that for those left without employment, stranded by natural disasters, exposed to the perils of war, or faced with dramatic influxes of refugees, the neoliberal mantras of individual merit, intense competition, and smart stock market bets are not going to be relevant. Yet nor is there, I think, nor is there any chance for the old liberal strategy of the 1950s and 60s, which consisted in redistributing the profits gained through the exploitation of workers at home and the imposition of violence abroad. That's what the American radicals of 1968 recognized as the welfare warfare state. In a world of unified flows, the hypocrisy of calling on capitalist surplus to repair just your part of what it damages is unbearable. So I don't call for any return to the welfare warfare state. In that light, the struggle against precarity by campaigns for a guaranteed minimum income appears as something like a foreshortened utopia. What's missing from this latter-day welfare state claim is an understanding of how to build institutional frames for local productivity, social solidarity, and ecological resilience, the three beacons on the dark horizon of the triple crisis. Precisely because these three beacons are not yet visible amidst the gloom, I'm going to propose, paradoxical as it may seem, that the vanguards of today have no choice, even if you live in a relatively well-off country. I think if you want to be part of the vanguards of today, you have no choice but to actually deepen the present crisis and refuse the invocations of those who proclaim that it is already over. By deepening the crisis, I do not mean the old ultra-leftist tactic of engaging in violent actions conceived to increase social tensions or destabilize power. Instead, I'm talking about durably internalizing that which is widely shared during brief moments of social disarray, which is the perception that capitalism itself is the crisis. Effective vanguards, in my view, can only rise from a powerful rejection of the society that they live in. Now, to make that point, I'd like to read you a quote from the American theorist James O'Connor, who lived in the 1970s and understood that time as a transformative process. A decade later, in a 1987 book called The Meaning of Crisis, he wrote these lines, which read like a description of the present. O'Connor says, "We know that capital is racing madly through the present. It has raced headlong into a crisis. It attempts to reduce its turnover time compulsively and obsessively. Modernization of production, internationalization of production, and a bloated debt structure are three sides of a single process. Whole cities and communities are thrown away in the race to defend and expand profits. Growth coalitions multiply like cancer cells, killing the normal cells of family, religion, tradition. The frenzy of accumulation, the fear that it will come to end in a huge crash or an environmental or military catastrophe, the unbelievable excesses of late capitalism worldwide, these bear witness to the obsessive-compulsive quality of the inner soul of capital. If we could become its inner eye, if we could transport ourselves into its inner soul, we could hear the relentless beat of accumulation. We could experience, as well as know, the madness of this obsessiveness. This world where capital and money are a religious and aesthetic experience, and where power is a moral category. When we examine ourselves, we find capital within our own souls. We too rush through the present. We race for some victory or toward some unknown destination. We are governed by unlimited desire. We stumble and fall from identity into the abyss. We create our own personal crisis as capital creates its own crisis. But I think that's what you have to do if you want to create art right now. That's my belief. You have to experience the insanity of this moment, I think. So what does it mean to create your own crisis? Here I have to shift from abstract theory to something very personal and localized: self-orientation. I want to go deeper into the morass of contemporary American class and race relations to explore some possibilities of social transformation. I wasn't born in Chicago, which I now call home, and it took me years to find my bearings in the city. The suburbs remained very difficult for me. I get lost in those places. But maybe one needs to get lost more often in one's home city. That way, you find out who else is living there. Since the Great Fire of 1873, the core city of Chicago along the shores of Lake Michigan has been surrounded by an expanding crown of westward stretching suburbs. You can see them there. Everything that isn't dark red represents the expansion of Chicago into a very large hinterland. A whole social world has grown up in what used to be the countryside. This edgeward drift accelerated when industrial congestion reached threatening proportions in the early 20th century. By the 1950s, the elites who controlled the city's destiny lived outside of its borders, to the northwest, in mansions close to the lakeshore and in the verdant river valleys. There lies the true north of power in this urban system. More massively throughout the western and southern suburbs, the detached home with double garage served as the basic platform of Fordist consumption. As David Harvey wrote in Consciousness and the Urban Condition, and I quote David, "A worker mortgaged up to the hilt is, for the most part, a pillar of social stability, and schemes to promote home ownership within the working class have long recognized this basic fact. The strictures or the constraints of the home mortgage serve to stabilize the rebellious populations of industrial workers whose inner city concentrations had furnished the key element in the progressive coalition of Roosevelt's New Deal back in the 30s. When that coalition broke apart along racial lines, through the cycle of urban riots that culminated after the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, the movement to the suburbs accelerated. White flight names the reactionary formation constituting the social base of the neoconservative power structure that emerged under Nixon, then consolidated all the way through the 2000s. So this is the world of the suburbs. I should tell you that I come from the suburbs in California. I was born with the two-car garage. That's actually what I've fled all my life, escaping to the historical cities of Europe, wandering the urban worlds of Latin America and Asia, then finally returning to an old industrial city in the US. And it's not just me. Generations have escaped in this way. So what I want to get to about knowing where you are is I want to get to two republics of white flight in the US. Let's start with the first one, out there in the suburbs. What struck me when I took the Ronald Reagan Memorial Highway to a middle-class paradise called Naperville is the sheer quantity of construction that goes on out there. Naperville is what the geographer Joel Garreau called Edge City. Along the freeway corridor, a layer of modernist corporate headquarters from the 1980s has been overtaken by newer mirrored buildings embodying the two phases of the computer boom, from the 1990s dot-com surge to the mid-2000s rollout of the mass surveillance industries, like Facebook, for instance. The data-gathering corporation Axiom has a building out there, and so does Alcatel-Lucent and Tel Labs and many other tech companies. In this corridor, one sees many private educational facilities, which call themselves universities, although they're really more like corporate training centers. You have also big box stores, Walmart, Target, and so on, which line the avenues between the gated suburban developments, which are still springing up in vast proliferating tracts. But the suburban areas are also dotted with shiny glass-skinned megachurches, complete with associated schools and social services. They are built in styles very similar to the corporate architecture of the freeway corridors. The churchgoers in their overgrown sport utility vehicles are the natural constituency of the tightly integrated ruling class that Julian Assange calls Family America. And I actually found a picture of Family America on the internet. I mean, this is really it, you know. The corporate Family America. It's intense, huh? It's intense. Edge City is the parallel world that the neocons built during the era of neoliberalism. September 11 cemented all its characteristics into an enduring ideology. The first republic of white flight believes in its own sprawling future. By chance, while I was out there, I met a friendly boat mechanic who led a Boy Scout troop and wore an eagle-emblazoned Never Forget t-shirt. Here's the guy. He gave me a window to the ways in which Family America imagines the next century. It will be prosperous, proactive, religious, and cautiously optimistic. You do not see doubt, satire, disbelief, or existential anxiety inscribed into this landscape. What you do see, or rather feel, coming out of the cracks is denial. The denial of climate change, of imperial blowback, of unsustainable private debt, of dependency on low-wage immigrant service workers, and perhaps closest to home, the denial of the inexorably rising middle-class unemployment brought on by the computerized industries that so many of these people work for. It's like a boiling cauldron in a deep freeze. Whenever this republic is threatened, as it was after September 11, another burst of G.W. Bush-style American fascism will not be long in coming. So what about the Second Republic? Already in the 50s, American bohemians were defecting en masse from what Henry Miller called the air-conditioned nightmare. They left on a long period of wandering through dissent, draft dodging, drugs, art, sexual experimentation, etc. But eventually, they had to settle down. The Second Republic of white flight, the flight from the suburbs, was launched by the so-called urban pioneers of the 70s. Today, we're talking about a full-scale reconquest of the old industrial cores by the middle classes in the form of young urban professionals who no longer want to suffer endless traffic jams and boring summer nights by the pool. The reconquest of downtown Chicago was brought to a conclusion in the 2000s by the second Mayor Daley, because, you know, we always have at least two of our politicians, a father and son. So the second Mayor Daley beautified the downtown loop and installed the new brand image of the city, which is an artwork in the form of a narcissistic funhouse mirror, which is known as Cloudgate, or more colloquially as the Bean. It gives you a chance to see yourself as the financial capital of the Midwest, to actually merge your own body with the architecture, and to take a tourist snap and to propagate the image of Chicago not as the city of broad shoulders and of the working class, but as the city of finance and of art. So this is the program in which we've all been involved, by the way, in the artistic sectors of gentrification. And this is, of course, part of the recuperation of 70s experimentation into everyday neoliberal life. Now, there's a lot to say about how this is continuing. There's a lot to say about the massive expropriation of low-income neighborhoods in the wake of the real estate crisis, because this process just keeps on going on, and the real estate crisis has been great for it. But I think, and this is really key for self-orientation, and you may find a way to practice this in your own city, in your own life, I think that the critique of co-optation, the critique of something like gentrification, should not cut off all access to a generational history. An intimate history of the near past is the only way to go deeply into the ambiguity of social relations. In its most positive light, the flight from the suburbs can be understood as the attempt to engage in relations of solidarity across the lines of class and race by joining those whom the corporate elites abandoned in the decaying public space of the post-industrial city. This desire was born out of the American civil rights movement from the late 1950s onward. It linked backwards to the cross-race, cross-class solidarities of the Roosevelt era. But above all, it looked forward and outward to the expansive emancipation projects that arose in the wake of decolonization all across the globe. After 1968, the desire to create a new society in the old urban cores was given shape in countless ad hoc and also institutional alternatives. It's still an explicit project, often followed by meaningful action, as in the images I have up here, among politicized city dwellers who refuse anything that smacks of family America. But on a much larger scale, this desire remains implicit as an aesthetic or as an unexpressed longing among all sorts of people who refuse basically to think politically and who rarely take part in any organized campaign or protest. Such longing, such aesthetic resources, I think are quite important. At the heart of the compromise formation that I called the flexible personality, you find a desire for racial justice, which, as the election of Barack Obama proved, is still a real political force in the USA. Of course, everything is done to discharge this desire on the carefully reworked tourist facades of cosmopolitan exoticism. If the first mission of flexible capitalism is to coordinate the worldwide movement of goods and the division of labor, its second mission is to cultivate the lushly perfumed poppies of managed political oblivion. And it's clearly quite good at that. Solidarity, the collective aspiration to racial equality is replaced by a discrete and ubiquitous mesh of aesthetic spectacle. Solidarity becomes something more like solid air. That's what the network spectacle is, a kind of landfill of the problematic gaps in social consciousness, so that mobility itself, physical movement through the city, is channeled, tracked, preempted, and voided of all its potentials. History and ecology become invisible, and the racialized other shrinks down to an electronic image locked into a tiny little box by copyright law for strictly private consumption. Watch it on your mobile phone. Give up to big data. This is the state of psychic desperation that has paralyzed the left, and not only in America. But look what's happening now. After the cinders of Occupy went cold, a new phase of the civil rights movement was launched, precisely by cell phone videos. Those unsteady, small-screen images move even white people to a sense of horror and unspeakable rage. Unspeakable in this context means that despite all efforts of imagination, you refuse to speak about what the people bearing the brunt of the police violence must feel. You don't identify, you don't claim to be those people or to know what they go through, but you do bear witness, and this is very much happening in the United States right now. In a recent collaboration, the poet Matthias Regan and I put together a geographic database of police killings of black people in the Midwest. Matthias wrote objectivist poems that sift through the media accounts of the killings, revealing the world we live in by the cut-up of its own brutal language. I placed pictures of the dead on a Google map where the lakes and rivers turn into blood. We called the map Watersheds, and we explained our intentions in a text whose title tells the whole story. Political ecology begins when we say Black Lives Matter. Intensifying conflicts, in my view, lend clarity to one's position in the social labyrinth. This summer, I learned to put the stakes of the present in short words. The violent expression of racism, which forms the molecular bond of nationalism, and therefore the crucial resource of empire, is the only distraction of sufficient emotional firepower to make our societies forget the urgent objective now of onrushing climate change. The US wars in the Middle East have shown how this is done. And the evolution of the European border system since 2011, with the return of outright fascist parties across the old continent, leads to the exact same conclusion. Of course, if you're white, you don't suffer in the same way from the abuse of the police. But over the middle and maybe even the short term, the failure to revive a political struggle for equality will leave everyone wide open to the militarist reactions that our decaying socio-environmental systems are already generating. Just as in the 1930s, the race question is once again going to be the hinge of world history. Decide on which side of that divide you want to take your stand. Not so much the network spectacle, but only fear and hatred of the other can make our societies stick their heads in the sand and go on preferring war for oil to any other possible future. So at this point, obviously, I would like to talk about that thing that Chiapello and Boltanski called the new spirit, a very ambiguous possibility, a new ethos of the present and of the future evolution of capital. It seems to me that there's a kind of a book somewhat missing from, and the people who wrote that book are maybe somewhat missing from this conversation because it's exactly on our theme. The book of the year on the UK shelves is called Inventing the Future, Post-Capitalism and a World Without Work. It's by Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams. It begins with a question. If we will not act after one of the largest crises of capitalism, then when? It goes on to demonstrate, and quite aggressively, I must say, the incapacity of Occupy-style direct democracy movements to influence the development of a complex world system. Yet very interestingly, it nonetheless insists that the refusal of all forms of domination, whether racist, sexist, classist, ableist, intellectualist, or whatever, is a positive gain from the 60s and 70s, which can't be turned back on. I just want to quote one representative passage from this very challenging book. Increasingly, multipolar global politics, economic instability, and anthropogenic climate change outpace the narratives we use to structure and make sense of our lives. Each of these is an example of what is termed a complex system, which features nonlinear dynamics, where marginally different inputs can cause dramatically divergent outputs, intricate sets of causes feedback on one another in unexpected ways, and which characteristically operates on scales of space and time that go beyond any individual's unaided perception. Any post-capitalist project will necessarily require the creation of new cognitive maps, political narratives, technological interfaces, economic models, and mechanisms of collective control to be able to marshal complex phenomena for the betterment of humanity. In one way, this passage fits perfectly with the notion of complex modeling that I borrowed from Félix Guattari and used to critique innumerable facets of the neoliberal control society in my book, Escape the Overcode. What became obvious, however, after the failure of the left to really seize the occasions of the structural crisis, except in Spain, by the way, is that critical and utopian models must be embodied in a constructive program, which is itself complex, flexible, and able to integrate the aspirations of people at many different positions in the global division of labor. What's missing, I think, is not broad left coalitions, hegemonic slogans, or political representation. What's missing are informed and capable people who can understand, take apart, and reassemble a technologically managed society. This requires both a knowledge of machines and a refusal of domination, including the domination of humanity over what is known as natural resources. That's a civilizational challenge, which cannot be pared down to the good old dialectical opposition of workers and capital. Instead, there really is a multitude of different subject positions, all threatened in different ways by the triple crisis. In the face of this civilizational challenge, which they have the merit of recognizing, Černeček and Williams call on the logic of populism, or the pre-political invocation of the majority, the people, as a way to begin integrating a great diversity of contradictory fears and demands. Their understanding of the populist call to the people is that it offers a first step to what they call an organizational ecology. By that they mean, and that's the interesting thing, by organizational ecology, they mean an expanding set of practical and pedagogical initiatives that can gradually transform their participants through multiple vectors of engagement with social movements, with media, with education, with production technologies, with scientific research, with cultural forums, with alternative architecture, and so on. Populism is probably not the best word for this process, since it has to involve many kinds of professionals, and since it will probably depend above all on the formation of a new transversalist ethos stimulated by the recognition of rapidly advancing climate change. Maybe the end of work isn't the best statement of its desire either, since a tremendous amount of discipline would be required for the work that is to be done. On the other hand, the authors do have a very good phrase for what they're doing: inventing the future. There's a lot to argue with in this book, beginning with the idea of full automation, which I think they really overestimate. I believe they don't see the dangers in capitalist automation as it's been practiced throughout the history of capitalism. There's also a lot to argue concerning the degree to which an organizational ecology has already been emerging over the last 20 years, even at the heart of the movements like Occupy, and especially, of course, the Indignados movement and others. I'll go deeper into Černeček and Williams' book in the published version of this essay. Maybe what surprised me most is the lack of any reference to a major programmatic model of social change that is now being worked out at significant scales and is well explained by the political consultant Jeremy Rifkin. What Rifkin sells, because he's a political consultant, he deals with the governments of the EU, of China, with national governments here and so on. What Rifkin sells as a growth package for a future investment wave is the model of what he calls a third industrial revolution centered on solar power and computerized micro-manufacturing. His first insight, and his most impressive one, is that localized electric power generated by windmills and solar panels on everyone's property or rented roof is only practical when it is hooked up to a centrally managed smart power grid that can channel the surplus electricity wherever it is needed. So Rifkin brings a collective principle, that is, a new form of the state, back into the equation. In this way, he combines the concerns for downscaling and local autonomy that all of the movements have developed, and that Černíček and Williams tend to disparage, with the concern for upscaling, complexity, and socialized infrastructure that the two British authors insist on. More importantly, Rifkin's strategic aim in calling for an investment wave, because he's really talking about the next wave of investment, in calling his strategic aim in calling for an investment wave centered on solar power, micro-manufacturing, and smart grids is to undo the hegemony of the giant corporations, particularly the oil companies, which are directly responsible for climate change and which also constitute the civilian component of military imperialism. The basic idea is stunningly simple. The basic idea is stunningly simple. What he thinks is that the generation of power for and by machines is the generation of power in society. That's very important. I mean, these are things that we have forgotten on the left, how to deal with machines. The way you generate power is what produces power in society. Look at the oil companies. Look at the military results of the forms of power that we now have. To change that, he's calling for the association of autonomous producers by means of a new state form, which some people now call a partner state, regulated and also limited in view of a general political ecology. Now that's the spirit in my view. I think this is something interesting. However, I'm totally suspicious of Rifkin, as I'm totally suspicious of the kind of technocratic side of Černíček and Williams, and I think any critical intellectual should be. We have to be responsible for the consequences and for the co-optation of our own experiments. To speak more specifically about the creation of institutional frames for local productivity, social solidarity, and ecological resilience, or what I called the three beacons, I want to end this talk with another reflection on urban form and self-orientation. This time it's about Detroit, the broken capital of Fordism, where a great rebellion occurred in 1967 and white flight was pushed the furthest, opening the streets for a black republic. However, and that's amazing, you got to go to the capital of Fordism, which is voided of its white inhabitants, which is voided of industry, which is in a state of ruin, but which is also a liberated city. The place is amazing. It's really worth a visit if you can. However, the very foundation of this black republic deprived it of an economy. And in that sense, Detroit is very much like a lot of places in what we used to call the third world, the undeveloped world. The city hit rock bottom after 2008, and today its downtown core is in the throes of mega gentrification. In Detroit, the cartography of class is crudely transparent. The major developer is the CEO of a predatory lender at the heart of the 2008 crisis called Quicken Loans. So the guy who made his money by stealing the homes of the poorest in society is now trying to take over and gentrify downtown Detroit. But the Detroit metro area is huge. Vast tracts are abandoned. The scale of decay is too big for real estate speculation to absorb. The question that's being asked, more intensely here than elsewhere, is how to replace a failed system. Last year, I traveled with other members of the Compass Group, Claire Pentecost and Sarah Lewison, to a conference entitled New Work, New Culture. There we heard a talk by Blair Evans, a black permaculturist and social entrepreneur who has put together a fab lab called Insight Focus. The main project of this fab lab is to use sophisticated but relatively cheap computer-controlled woodworking and metalworking equipment to make an integrated house and winter vegetable garden powered by the sun for around $10,000 if the labor is done by the future inhabitants. Homemade cars getting 100 miles to the gallon are also under development in the city that General Motors built. From Evan's viewpoint, corporations make poor people sell their work wholesale, that is to say cheap, and buy their lives back retail, that is to say at a profit for the people who sell them the goods that they need. A losing equation if you are allowed to participate in the job system at all. Insight Focus seeks to develop micro-manufacturing capacities that can meet local needs through a new kind of labor activity known as community production. For the first time in my life, I got a real taste of the constructive imagination. What's being envisioned, and not just by Evans, is a way to generate grassroots resilience in the face of organized abandonment and in the face of the coming ravages of climate change. Instead of denying the machines we live by, as traditional environmentalism has done, the idea is to foster a social ecology of machinic empowerment at grips with the problems of race and class, quite unlike most technology projects. Community production is conceived in light of climate chaos and offered as a practical model at a time of penury and everyday disaster. Pragmatic goals are used to measure success or failure. The project brings racial justice issues directly to grips with the emerging forms of industrial activity on which a decarbonized future can be founded. This means that without betraying vital self-interest, people can place themselves on a pathway that implies basic changes in social relations over the middle term, notably breaking the vice grip of mass manufacturing and power generation conglomerates. On the horizon of this experiment, but only on the horizon, in the distance, is a new state form, able to provide multi-scale support networks for productive communities. Deep, unfulfilled aspirations merge with complex organizations to take up daily struggles. This is something more than a critique or a utopia. The map of the world is in the palm of your hand. It's a living picture, but it's also a tool for making something new.
Okay, so we will have some questions and spend a little bit of time on general discussion. Maybe you just join us as well, Isabell, and then we have a question in the front row. Start with that.
So Brian, thank you very much. I'm very happy to hear your presentation and all these thoughts related to the crisis. I would just like to ask you to clarify a bit more. Do you see the climate change as a part of the, so to say, capitalist crisis circle? You know, which is because if we think about the crisis in the terms of new field of the capitalist reproduction, like that capitalism is always looking for the non-capitalist field to reproduce itself. Isn't it like a climate change just a package, which a capitalism like integrated inside of this circle? And in that context, if we think about how to change the concept of growth and how to think about social and ecological transformation, like this transformation should be social and ecological, and in that sense, how to imagine the future. I would like to ask you also how you would place concrete political action, maybe in the context of multilactics. You know, like you say, this dialectic or binary position is not functioning. You know, this is what you're also explaining. But how we can invent this new multilactics or some kind of new model?
I get it. Okay, we should stop there, or I won't be able to remember. But thank you. That's quite a rich question. First, of course, yes, capitalism in the short run, and Matteo Pasquinelli assures me this is what's happening in Germany. Capitalism can make a profit off pretending to solve the climate change dynamic, which nothing can solve, by the way. There's no solving that at this point. So, and this is the most likely possibility to put a veneer of legitimacy on a possible next growth wave of capitalism. So that is obviously something one must guard against. However, I think that climate change is already upon us. We already have not just the kind of weather events that destroy houses and bits of cities and so on, but we've already had a major food crisis in 2008. And these things, I think, will continue. And moreover, I think that because we are, at this point, there are so many educated people in the world, the influence of science is so great, we can really see this future. In this case, the future is now, you know. We live with it. We live with the knowledge of it. And in that respect, I think that the real struggle is, in fact, over what will be the response to climate change during the next wave of capital expansion. A wave which is not here yet. Clearly, we're in the midst of a tremendous chaos, as I tried to demonstrate. But it is almost certain to come. It would be miraculous. In fact, it's almost certain to come, sorry, in the worst way possible, unless we get a little busier on these things. But people are reacting, and particularly to climate change, and also to the other forms of dispossession that are going on and of war. So this is an interesting moment. Now, no crisis is like the preceding crisis. I think that something fundamental has in effect happened to change the dialectic, the former dialectic that Marxism identified. And I think you can read this change in the Grundrisse, in the fragment on machines, which everyone has looked to. Only I think one should read it a little bit more simply. Marx talks about what happens when automation becomes so fully accomplished that human beings are the mere guardians of the technological process. Well, this is obviously true in many ways today. The power of machines, you must see the new mining machines. I mean, you must think of this, I think, in terms strictly of industrial power, not so much in linguistic terms. No, in terms of machines that transform the earth. And I think what happens are two things. I think one, the old centrality of the proletariat is largely dissolved. Workers are less and less important to a society that achieves this degree of machinic power. But two things happen as that centrality moves. It doesn't disappear, but it moves into the background. The first thing is that the older forms, the archaic forms of domination become much more important. And this is what we see with the violence of anti-immigrant, racist violence, and so on. The other thing that happens is that indeed the linguistic, scientific, philosophical, and so on propensities of human beings develop much more. And you get a profusion, not only of classes, but above all of subject positions. Different kinds of people who are no longer reducible to the opposition between capital and labor. And that's been going on for a long time because the addition of the social state to the capitalist formation changed it very, very deeply by creating these institutions whose remainders we're in now, you know? Educational institutions, cultural institutions, scientific institutions, care institutions, and so on. So that leads to, yes, some kind of multilectic. And in this multilectic, what we mainly have is confusion. What we mainly have is the inability to locate a project. And that's why I think that it is, in terms of being oriented, I think that the question of, the climate change should be added to the other two questions of massive unemployment and of geopolitical strife to really compose this vision of a triple crisis, which I think really deeply worries people. And I think perhaps it would be possible to set up much more transversal types of collaborations than one could have imagined before. And I think that's just beginning, but I really think it needs to go further. And so, of course, there's a lot of self-critique from my part on the limits of positions that I used to hold. I think those positions should be rethought. I really think that as the new world emerges, I think there's a lot of work to be done on creating an ethos that's adequate to that world, and therefore on that basis of politics that's adequate to that world. And that's what I was trying to express in this very weird and rambling and strange paper that I just read. Sorry.
Yeah, we have a question down here.
Hi, thank you for the talk to both speakers. I think, Brian, I'm addressing Brian, I think what you've described is highly voluntaristic. It doesn't really say how all this will happen, and I can't see how the antagonism between capital and labor has at all left the field. I think also that in the 70s, something really big happened in America. America invented New Age, and it killed the Black Panthers. It made a choice over where to direct, with the biosphere too, I think, and so on. It really made a serious decision about how to depoliticize the ecological struggle. And this is something that carries on today. If you go to many kind of ecological communities and so on, you'll see they're completely depoliticized. And from that perspective, capital does seem irrelevant. There seems like there is no struggle. But I really wonder if this is at all the case. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I understand the question very much. The way that now ecology is thought in the United States is mainly through environmental justice. Environmental justice places what are known as frontline communities. That is, the communities who are most damaged by the exactly present forms of environmental destruction, and considers that it is by starting from those communities, who are oftentimes not working communities, they're communities left in abandonment, but who continue to live and to have lives and to have agency. That is by joining those communities and recognizing perhaps our own disempowerment and the need to struggle in their struggles that we can begin things. I don't mean to say that the working class doesn't mean anything anymore. What I'm trying to say is that you can't deduce the entire logic of a struggle against that very powerful force that you just described from that relation between capital and labor. And this is very urgent to not try to do that anymore, because I think, I'm sorry about this is a very cold thing to say, but I think the power of capital is immense. And I think the insanity of it is also immense. And I don't think that if we cannot expand the conception of who can be an antagonist to capital from the traditional working classes to a wide range of classes, including ourselves, and probably including also people who are today the owners of capital, I don't think that we will be able to defeat this thing. I think it is able to master the problems, and I think that's what it's doing right now. So we have, unfortunately, unless this anxiety about the consequences of what capital is now doing finds organizational forms, then the crisis will run its course. And that is not going to be the world of my aspirations.
But the world of Rifkin's aspirations, I think.
Well, it's not Rifkin.
No?
No, Rifkin wants to get rid of the massive corporations. Mm-hmm. No, he has an interesting aspiration.
But maybe it would be interesting to return a little bit to the notion of precarity and its relationship to flexibility as well, and try and see what I think the thing that you raised, Isabell, is how it individualizes the problem. And I think this is part of the discussion was also this afternoon, not necessarily how it's individualized only, even though everybody felt it on an individual level, but that it also somehow is localized. And how can we, for example, compare the situation of the refugees in Europe with the kind of race killings, police organized race killings in the United States, and the antagonisms that it attests to? How can we compare these without conflating them?
Sometimes it doesn't make so much sense to combine everything with everything. But I think it's a strong thesis. What comes into my mind is that concerning the racist violence of white policemen, we have to speak about hegemonic white masculinity, yeah? And perhaps this could be the link on to Europe and the refuse and border building against refugees and against migrants. And it's not all about that, but it has a lot to do with hegemonic white masculinity.
We have another comment down there, and then.
Thank you very much. I think that your presentation is a perfect answer to the lecture by Isabell, because it shows that the only alternative to the welfare state is the development of police state. And this is what you basically showed. So the rosy picture that Isabell presented is somehow discarded by you. And I would say that if welfare state was gendered, as Isabell says, it was gendered in positive way, because it provided a lot of work for the women. And the women are the first victims of the processes of dismantling of the welfare state. They are among the army of unemployed persons. But the development of the police state is gendered negatively, because most of the prisoners are males. So we have this alternative is completely different than what's presented by Isabell. But I think that there is some light in this refugee immigration crisis, because what we call by the crisis actually should be called the beginning of the movement for the freedom of personal movement. We have the capitalist freedom of the movement of goods, but we see that there is no freedom of the movement of people. So in this case, I think this may be the beginning of the really revolutionary movement that will completely change the face of the world, if it succeeds. But if it succeeds, and if the people will move around the world to the places they want to move, there should be established the system of global welfare.
I mean, this was what I was trying to get at, that by pointing to the really large solidarity that does exist in the United States in the face of the movement to expose police violence against black people, I was implicitly trying to, suggest that what's happening in Europe with a really pretty broad, set of solidarities towards the coming migrants is I think really the hinge on which things are going to develop. And I also think that, of course, these situations are quite different from the United States and from Europe. I mean, I was trying to be specific and show some of the frameworks in which our society is evolving in America and in the Americas. I think that, one has to be specific and true to one's own location in the world, and therefore I don't think that I could not have a discourse as Isabell does in America That's the whole thing, is that we're not in the same places, and the state of the state is not the same in those places.
I agree, and yeah, just to say, to refuse the combination of a police state to welfare state, it's we don't understand anything if we try to understand what is going on in Europe. Let's keep in Europe. To call it a police state, it's about the. I think we have to understand the self-governability and the forms of self-governing must be the. Of course, we have to analysis, of course, political, economic, legal structures, of course. But we have to understand our involvement in the form of, the way the way of our subjectivation. We are involved of the situations, the structures, the relations we want to get rid of. And it's not about surveillance and control coming from outside. It's not the story.
Well, very quickly then, I had two, but I will say was one. Well, I was a bit disappointed because you didn't really develop what you announced, the relationship between the contestation and the crisis. I mean, twofold. And of course, there are a lot of things to say about this. I don't want to ask you to develop entirely. I'll read somewhere else. But I would have, what would you say to such hypothesis? I mean, maybe addressed to both of you, matter of fact, even if it's a quite Marxist question. Isn't it possible that simply the experience of 68, where most of the long 68, where most of the contestation happened before the crisis, actually it happened during the period of the most spectacular capitalistic growth, in a sense taught capitalism that crisis is a lesser evil than prosperity for capitalism, and that in this sense they are not really desperately seeking to overcome the crisis, even if, of course, crisis hurts them as well. I mean, it costs. Well, thank you.
I don't really see it that way, no. I think that, the crises are different. The one indeed, the crisis of the 70s began with a political crisis, not an economic one. But the economic one ensued immediately thereafter, and much social experimentation, not only in the West, but throughout the world, was carried out during the 1970s. And that was, in fact, quite a threat to capital. In the most economic terms, it resulted in the rise of resource prices from around the world. And you had a long stagnation, which was marked on two sides by oil embargoes and the rise of the oil price, and which was then the situation was only reversed when basically a reorganization of the monetary system was carried out in the early 1980s by the Reagan government, but also by the Thatcher government. Now by the combination of the governments and the transnational unified Anglo-American financial class. And that was very successful, and it broke the back of the third world self-assertion. And at the same time, you had the new forms of culture which began to integrate the forms of culture, which came not only from the outburst of 68, but afterwards from the embodying, from living those models for a long time, and for some people still. And I think that integration, I talk about it a lot in my text on the flexible personality. What are the forms that gave us, Much of one's life today is in fact governed by those forms. The way that we feel, the way that we relate to each other, our sexuality, our patterns in work, and so on, are decisively conditioned by the integration of alternative, let's say, revolt and dissidence, and even some of the in what's the third category of institutional collaboration, of sort of impact on society. All that has been integrated and made the capitalism of the 90s and up to this day is given it the aspect that it's had. It was neoliberal. It was a transformed liberalism. It was the repurposing of the forms of the welfare state utopia for a dystopian capitalist society. And in that respect, we don't criticize ourselves enough. We are very, especially in the cultural sector, we're extremely lax on understanding the degree to which we really continue, even in our theorizing and so on, to feed this system and to cover up the really savage differences of class and of access to possibility that the system creates. And that I think, is something that really would help to get through the next crisis. Maybe we could have responded a little to 2008 if we weren't so thoroughly integrated to this system, if we had some kind of organization, some kind of discipline, some kind of strategy, which is not apparent.
Okay, a bit of a counter speech. I think the clue of biopolitics and governmentality that transforms since, I don't know, since several centuries, when you put theories Foucault, it is a way of governing that our way of living, our embodiment, the way we relate to each other is deeply capitalized and deeply a way of different historical specific different forms of biopolitics. So this is the ground from which I reject and disagree with the arguments of Boltanski and Chapello. I would argue the other way around. I would say we forgot too much practices we already invented in the 70s. I would argue we have to go back and actualize it in the current situation. Not be romantic about it, but actualize it. Learn about it in the transformation in the present. And not argue that everything we did, or friends did, or however, we did in the 70s, our inventive energy was corrupted and adopted by capitalism. No, I would argue the other way around.
And I would argue for an ambiguity, which is a bit of both arguments, to tell you the truth.
So I think on that note, we'll have to finish. There was lots of topics that we didn't have time to get into. For me, I think what is interesting about these also discussions of precarity and crisis is how would they actually form the contours of a new political economy of the former West. But that's something that we will return to tomorrow, and hopefully people can discuss now over food, and that we will talk about tomorrow. So thanks a lot.